This is what happens when we lower our standards. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before the Admiral's heart stopped and 5 doctors refused to save him. The words hung in the amphitheater air like a blade, and 60 residents turned to watch Rachel Torres stand motionless in the third row, her jaw clenching once, barely visible, as he held up her charting like a trophy he'd won. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, clinical and cold, casting everything in that particular shade of white that made mistakes look worse than they were. Whitfield's voice carried the tone of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room, each syllable precisely measured, each pause calculated for maximum effect. His expensive shoes, Italian leather, probably $2,000 minimum, crossed the polished floor as he paced, never looking directly at her, which somehow made it worse. The charting pages moved in his hands like evidence of a crime. He read them aloud. Documentation delays on the 14th, incomplete assessment notes on the 18th. A medication reconciliation flagged for review on the 22nd. He catalogued every minor notation issue from her 3 weeks at Seattle General in Portland, his voice never wavering, his expression never shifting. What he did not mention was that she had covered for shifts in 5 days. What he did not mention was that the overnight nurse quit without notice on the 18th and Rachel had worked a double. What he did not mention was that 2 of those documentation delays occurred during a level 1 trauma response when every moment was spent keeping a stabbing victim alive rather than catching up on paperwork. He simply read the list and shook his head with the disappointment of a father who expected better. The silence in the room was so thick you could have operated in it. 60 residents held their breath. Rachel's hands remained at her sides, steady as surgical steel, her face blank as a marble bust in a museum nobody visited anymore. She did not look away. She did not look down. She simply stood there and let him build his case like an architect of humiliation, brick by brick, word by word, the weight of institutional authority pressing down like a patient monitor's steady beep, reliable, relentless, impossible to ignore. He finished and finally turned to face her, his eyebrows raised in a gesture of rhetorical question. The other residents shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The air smelled like hand sanitizer and the particular staleness of a room where too many people breathed recycled atmosphere for too long. Whitfield smiled, not a warm expression, but the kind of smile a shark wears when it tastes blood in the water. Then he set her charting down on the podium and moved on to the next slide without another word, as if she had already ceased to exist. The message was clear. The message was, you are not one of us. The message was, you do not belong here. 2 hours later, Rachel stood by the vending machines on the 2nd floor, selecting coffee with methodical precision. Black. Nothing else. The machine hummed and deposited the paper cup with mechanical indifference. She could hear the 2 attendings before she saw them, their voices pitched low but not low enough, the particular carelessness of people who believed themselves alone, or who did not care if they were overheard. They stood 3 feet away, leaning against the wall beside the sandwich section, and one of them, Chen, she thought, from the cardiology floor, was shaking his head with theatrical amusement. The temp nurse who thinks she's special, he said, the words carrying the tone of inside joke shared among the chosen. Comes in here acting like she knows the protocols better than the residents who've been here 6 months. His colleague, Okafor, probably, the surgery rotation who wore his competence like a designer watch, laughed. It was the particular laugh that comes from confirmed superiority, from the comfort of belonging to the right group. Whitfield's going to run her off. Did you see that charting takedown in grand rounds? Guy didn't even raise his voice. Just crushed her in front of everyone. Beautiful. Rachel's thumb ran across the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket, the metal worn smooth by 20 years of habit and pressure. She did not turn around. She did not acknowledge that she could hear every word. She selected her coffee payment, watched the transaction complete on the glowing screen, $2.75, the amount exact and ordinary, and turned toward the corridor with her cup held level, her movements efficient and economical. She passed within 3 feet of them. Chen's words dried up mid-sentence. For just a moment, the 3 of them occupied the same space, the same air, and then Rachel continued down the hallway as though they were not there at all, as though they were part of the infrastructure, pipes and wiring and structural support, necessary but invisible, not worth acknowledging. The coffee was bitter. She took a sip anyway. Pain was information. Information was useful. By late afternoon, Whitfield cornered her outside the ICU, his timing too perfect to be accidental. She was checking the medication cart, verifying doses with the precision of someone who understood that one miscalculation could cost a life, when his shadow fell across the cart and his voice emerged from behind her like a door opening onto something she had not invited. "Rachel," he said, and the use of her first name should have felt personal but instead felt like the first move in a chess game where she did not know the rules. A word. She straightened, turned, and waited. Her expression remained neutral, a flat plane of professional courtesy that revealed nothing. He gestured her away from the ICU entrance, toward a quiet hallway that opened onto a bank of windows overlooking the parking lot. Late afternoon light slanted through the glass at an angle that made everything look like a photograph of itself. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the casual tone of a man discussing whether or the quality of the hospital cafeteria coffee. Conversational. Unguarded. Which was exactly what made it deadly. "I've noticed some irregularities in your employment history," he said, not looking at her, his gaze instead fixed on the parking lot below where cars moved in orderly patterns. Gaps. Transitions. The kind of thing that makes credentialing boards curious. Rachel did not respond. Silence was a tool. Silence gave nothing away. "I've already reached out to the board," he continued, still in that casual tone, the tone of a man sharing gossip rather than delivering a threat. "Just letting them know they might want to look a bit more closely at your background. Professional courtesy, you understand. We take our standards very seriously here at Seattle General." He finally turned to face her, and his expression was pleasant, the kind of pleasant that came from absolute certainty of victory. "One more mistake, Rachel. One more documentation error, one more complaint, one more anything, and I'll have security escort you out of this building in front of everyone. Is that clear?" It was not a question. His hands were relaxed at his sides. His breathing was even. He was not angry. Anger required passion. This was something colder and more efficient, a man wielding institutional power like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, precise and purposeful and utterly without doubt. He had already contacted the credentialing board. He had already set in motion the machinery that would crush her if she gave him any leverage at all. He had already decided her fate. He was simply waiting to watch it happen. Rachel met his eyes. "Understood," she said. "Nothing else. No explanation. No justification. No plea. Just acknowledgement, flat and final." He nodded, satisfied, and walked back toward the ICU without another word. She finished her rounds on autopilot, her hands moving through the motions that had become second nature, checking monitors, adjusting fours, recording vitals with the mechanical precision of someone whose body could operate independently of her thoughts. The Admiral in room 4 was stable, his monitors steady, his breathing even. She adjusted his blanket and checked his medication drip and made a note in his chart and moved on to the next patient and the next and the next. Her jaw remained tight but her hands remained steady. She did not allow her breathing to change. She did not allow her expression to shift. It was only when she was alone in the supply closet, surrounded by shelves of sterile gauze and saline bags and medical tape in every color of beige and white, that her hands finally shook. She was restocking the crash cart, the same crash cart she had prepped that morning with the same methodical attention, when the tremor started. It was not fear. Fear would have been easier. This was restraint, the kind of tremor that comes from holding something back, from preventing herself from doing something that could not be undone. She pressed her palms flat against the gauze packages and breathed through her nose and waited for the shaking to stop. 20 years ago, in Fallujah, during a classified operation that the Navy had buried so thoroughly that officially Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres did not exist, she had learned how to endure things that should have broken her. She had learned how to keep functioning when everything inside her screamed to break something. She had learned how to smile and nod and move forward while carrying weight that no one could see. She had learned it all, and she had done it all, and she was doing it again, and it was working right up until the moment it was not. At 2:47 a.m., the monitor alarm screamed. Not beeped. Screamed. A sound like a siren built into the walls of room 4, high and piercing and cutting through the dead hospital night like a blade through skin. Rachel was already moving before the sound finished its first wail. She was out of the charting station, gloves snapping on as she walked, her body crossing the distance to the Admiral's room in 3 strides, her hands reaching for the crash cart before anyone else even opened their eyes. The Admiral lay on the bed with his chest already open. Already cracked from emergency surgery 6 hours earlier, sterile drapes soaked dark with blood, his exposed heart visible beneath the surgical lights in a shade of grey that meant no oxygen was moving through it anymore. Ventricular fibrillation. VFib. The worst rhythm to see on a monitor because it meant the heart was panicking, firing random electrical impulses that looked like screaming on a screen, and every second it screamed was a second the brain was dying. Rachel's hands moved on their own. Field hospital muscle memory, the kind of training that didn't live in thought but in bone, in the place where hesitation became a luxury you could not afford. She placed her palms flat against the closed portion of his chest and began compressions, counting aloud in that controlled way that made the sound of her voice cut through the alarm like someone had turned down the volume on everything else. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Compressions with the force of someone who had held people together while their bodies fell apart. 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. The ICU resident appeared in the doorway, young enough that the skin around his eyes still had that tight, panicked look of someone who had not yet learned that some crises followed rules you could count on. He went pale at the sight of the open chest. His hand reached for the phone on the wall. "I'm calling the attending," he said, though his voice came out like a question. The overhead page crackled to life. 5 times. The hospital had 5 senior attending physicians within the building right now. 5 doctors with the rank and the authority and the years of experience that meant they could walk into this room and take command of what was happening here. Rachel knew who they were. She had been working at Seattle General for 3 weeks. Long enough to know the rosters, long enough to know that Dr. Whitfield had already contacted for others, had already assembled a coalition of people who would follow his lead, people he had leverage over through recommendation letters and shift scheduling and the 1,000 small currencies of power that circulated in a teaching hospital. The resident's pager buzzed. He looked at the screen. His face went blank in that specific way that meant he was reading instructions he did not want to follow. What did he say? Rachel did not look up from the compressions. 1 and 2 and 3. The rhythm was everything. The rhythm was life. Dr. Whitfield says to stand down, the resident said quietly. He says wait for the St. Vincent's attending. 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. The Admiral had been in arrest for maybe 90 seconds. Every 60 seconds that passed meant 10% more brain damage, meant the difference between walking and vegetative, meant the difference between living and being a body that kept breathing because machines told it to. 15 minutes was not a medical timeline. 15 minutes was a message. 15 minutes was Whitfield making a choice about who got to live and who got to die and making it absolutely clear that the choice had nothing to do with medicine. Rachel looked at the monitor. Flatline still screaming. She looked at the Admiral's face, that familiar structure of bone that she had memorized 20 years ago in a burning vehicle in Fallujah when he was 9 years old and his name meant something else and his father was bleeding out against her leg while the boy screamed for someone to make it stop. She remembered pressing the challenge coin into her palm after she tied the tourniquet, remembered his father's hand shaking so badly that the coin almost dropped onto the sand. "Hand me a fresh set of gloves," Rachel said to the resident. Her voice had dropped an octave. The voice of someone who was about to do something that would not be forgiven and did not care about forgiveness anymore. "And call the crash cart to standby. Fresh sterile drapes. I'm going in." "What?" The resident's eyes widened. "No." Whitfield said. "I know what he said," Rachel replied. She held out her hand. The resident placed gloves in her palm. She snapped them on with the sound of a whip crack. 30 seconds ago he said someone in a teaching hospital had lowered their standards. Now he's about to find out what actually happens when someone stops playing by his rules. She leaned over the Admiral's body. She could see inside the thoracic cavity, could see the architecture of ribs and membrane and the heart itself, that fist-sized engine that had been beating for 63 years and was now just a grey stone sitting in the center of his chest. Rachel's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before, who had learned it not in a simulation lab but in a field hospital outside Fallujah when the only choice was to act or watch someone die. She slid both gloved hands into the open cavity. The warmth of blood. The slickness of exposed organs. The immediate tactile knowledge of where everything was because anatomy did not lie and muscle memory did not care about hospital policy. She found the heart. She positioned her hands. And she began. Manual cardiac massage. Fingers compressing the left and right ventricles with the precise rhythm that she had learned from an actual Navy combat surgeon in a tent with mortars falling outside and a 9-year-old boy's father telling her to save him, to save the boy. That was all that mattered anymore. 1 and 2 and 3. The compression was firm enough to move blood but gentle enough not to rupture, not to destroy the very organ she was trying to save. 4 and 5 and 6. The hiss of air escaping from the monitors as they recalibrated, as the machine that tracked his oxygen began to register numbers that were not zero. The resident stared at her hands inside the Admiral's open chest. His mouth had opened slightly, as if he was about to speak and then realized that there were no words for what he was watching. Call the team back, Rachel said without looking up from her work. All 5. Tell them we have a viable patient and we need them now. That's not a request, resident. That's an order from the person who is actively keeping him alive. The resident's hand shook slightly as he reached for the phone. The crash cart team was already moving through the hospital, already heading for this room, already responding to the call that had gone out minutes ago. They would arrive in seconds. And then Whitfield would have to make a choice. He could walk through that door and find Rachel Torres with her hands literally inside a Navy Admiral's chest, performing the only intervention that could possibly keep him alive while they waited for the real cavalry, the St. Vincent's attending who was still 13 minutes away, and he could order her to stop, could order her to step away and let the Admiral die rather than let her defy him. Or he could watch. The monitor began to register the compressions. Numbers climbing. 60% oxygen saturation. 70. The electrical activity on the screen still chaotic but no longer flatline. The Admiral's body was responding. His blood was moving again. His brain was getting oxygen again. Rachel did not stop. She would not stop. She had made a choice in the supply closet earlier that night when her hands shook with the force of restraint and rage. She had made a choice in Fallujah when she chose to save a boy instead of herself. She had made choices in 1,000 moments and kept quiet about all of them, kept her head down and her voice small and her hands steady while the world decided what she was worth. The moment was here. The moment where everything changed. She could feel it coming like a helicopter on the horizon, like the arrival of something that could not be stopped once it started moving. The crash cart team burst through the door. By 6 a.m., Rachel Torres sat in the administrator's office with her badge and ID on the desk between them like evidence at a crime scene. The badge was navy blue with her photograph, a younger woman with harder eyes, before Portland, before Whitfield. The administrator, a woman named Margaret Chen with silver reading glasses and a coffee stain on her blouse, kept her hands folded on the mahogany surface. She had not made eye contact for 4 minutes. 3 board members have already called, Margaret said, her voice like someone reading a grocery list. The credentialing office received the complaint at 4:33 a.m. An expedited review panel has been assembled for this morning at 9. She paused, adjusted her glasses. You're suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. Your badge is deactivated. Security will inventory your locker within the hour. Rachel's jaw did not clench. Her hands did not shake. She sat in the chair across from Margaret like she was waiting for a bus, her posture perfect, her eyes fixed on the badge as though it belonged to someone else. The hospital's legal team has advised us that this is the only responsible course of action given the circumstances, Margaret continued, filling the silence because silence terrified administrators more than any accusation. Your actions during the code fell outside the scope of your nursing license. The patient's attending, she stopped. Dr. Whitfield has documented everything. He has concerns about a pattern of behavior. The door opened. Whitfield entered without knocking, his presence arriving before his body, filling the small office with the weight of a man who had already won. His arms were crossed. His face was the color of a man who had not slept, which made him more dangerous, not less. These were the men who did not stop until everything burned. He stood by the window overlooking the Portland skyline, the rain hammering the glass like fists demanding entry. "Master Chief," he said, and the rank fell from his mouth like an accusation. "You saved his life last night. That's the problem." He turned to face her. "You violated protocol. You contravened direct orders. You performed a procedure outside your scope of practice on an open surgical patient. You took it upon yourself to make a medical decision that could have killed him." Rachel did not move. "I have contacted 5 attending physicians," Whitfield continued, pacing now, his voice dropping into the register of a man speaking to an audience of 1. Chen. Morrison. Okafor. Brennan. All of them witnessed your insubordination. All of them will testify that you acted without authorization, without supervision, that you put this hospital at risk of a catastrophic malpractice suit." He turned to Margaret. "And that's before we discuss the credentialing irregularities." The rain intensified. The sound filled the office like white noise, like static from a radio between stations. Margaret cleared her throat. "Dr. Whitfield has indicated that given the severity of the situation, the hospital cannot keep you on staff while the investigation proceeds. We have a duty to our patients. We have a duty to this institution." She slid an envelope across the desk. "Your final paycheck. Your health insurance ends at end of business today. You'll need to surrender your building access card to security before you leave the premises." Rachel picked up the envelope. Inside was a check for $847, which represented 3 days of work and a decade of expectation she should have known better than to have. Whitfield had moved to the door. His hand was on the frame. "You came to my hospital," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had already drafted his narrative, who had already spoken to journalists who owed him favors, who had already calculated how many people would believe his version of events. "You came here from some reserve somewhere with a nursing degree that's apparently from an accelerated program in some online school, and you thought you could override protocol. You thought you could ignore me. You thought," he stopped himself, composed himself. "You thought wrong." After he left, Margaret waited 30 seconds before speaking again. "Please turn in your badge," she said gently, because gentleness was somehow worse than cruelty. "To the security desk. On your way out." Rachel stood. She placed the badge on the desk with the same care a mortician uses when closing a casket. She did not speak. She did not look at Margaret. She walked to the door, and the sound her shoes made on the tile floor was like the ticking of a clock counting down to something that had already been decided. Whitfield had activated his network by then, had already made calls to board members with his version of events, had already framed Rachel as a reckless temp nurse who had endangered a patient, had already positioned himself as the whistleblower protecting the hospital from liability rather than a doctor whose orders had been defied. The hospital administration, terrified of being sued, terrified of being seen as complicit in recklessness, had no choice but to comply. 3 board members had called back within an hour. Legal had sent an email at 5:16 a.m. with the subject line "Immediate action required." By the time Rachel's locker was being inventoried by a security guard who avoided her eyes, the decision had been made in triplicate, notarized by people who had never met her and never would. At 3 a.m., Rachel sat in the East Side Diner on Division Street, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the waitress never asked questions. The cup in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. The diner was empty except for a man at the counter reading yesterday's newspaper and the waitress, a woman in her 60s with violet eyeshadow and the kind of hands that had spent 40 years holding other people's stories. Rachel stared at her reflection in the black window. The glass showed her a woman in scrubs that no longer meant anything, her hair in a bun, her face a map of a person who had learned not to expect mercy. Outside, rain fell in sheets, and the parking lot was empty except for a car with its headlights on, waiting for someone who might never come back. The challenge coin was still in her pocket. She had not surrendered it. They had inventoried her locker, catalogued her trauma shears, counted her pens, but they had not asked about the coin. It was tarnished silver, the kind of weight that came from age and being held by hands that had learned how to say goodbye without speaking. On one side was an insignia worn smooth by decades of touch. On the other side, barely visible, was an inscription, "For those who hold the line." She ran her thumb across the surface, and the metal was warm, like skin. The waitress appeared, refilled the cup without asking. "You waiting for somebody?" she asked, and the question contained so much kindness that Rachel almost could not bear it. "No," Rachel said. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone underwater. "Just sitting." But that wasn't what she was doing. She was waiting for the phone call that would not come, for the recognition that would not arrive, for the truth to matter in a world where truth was just another commodity that the powerful could buy or bury. She was waiting for the moment when she understood that saving a man's life twice meant nothing if the first time had been classified, if the second time could be erased by a doctor's phone call and an administrator's fear. She was waiting to understand how she had moved from a field hospital in Fallujah where her choices mattered to a Portland diner where her choices meant nothing at all. But she did not move. She did not call anyone. She did not pick up her phone or drive to the hospital or demand an explanation. She sat in the booth with the cold coffee and the reflection of a woman she had stopped recognizing, and she waited for whatever came next. The sound came first. Rotor wash hammering the air like thunder trapped in a box, rattling windows on the 4th floor, shaking coffee cups in the break room. Rachel looked up from the diner's black window where her reflection had been staring back at her for 6 hours. The time on her phone said 11:07 a.m. She didn't move. She had learned long ago that some sounds meant you stayed still and let the world come to you. 3 hums pulled into the emergency bay with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory and military planning. Not fast. Not reckless. The vehicles moved like a coordinated organism, each one knowing exactly where to be, their tires crunching the gravel in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Rachel watched through the diner window as the hospital doors opened and 2 figures emerged, Marines in dress blue so sharp they looked like they could cut glass, their uniforms the color of midnight and dress white covers gleaming in the pale Portland morning light. They walked through the lobby of Seattle General like they owned the building. Like the building had been waiting for them to arrive. The front desk nurse tried to intercept them, professional smile already warming on her face. One of the Marines raised a single hand, the gesture containing more authority than most people could convey with a full paragraph of words. "We're looking for a woman," he said, his voice flat and measured. "Call sign Reaper. She works here." Rachel's hands went completely still. The coffee cup stopped moving. Her lungs seemed to forget their rhythm for a full 3 seconds. Reaper. Not Rachel. Not the temp nurse from Seattle. Not the woman Dr. Whitfield had spent 3 weeks systematically demolishing. Reaper was someone else. Someone from 20 years ago, someone from a life that had been officially buried in classified files and redacted government records, someone the Navy had ordered to disappear after a mission in Fallujah went sideways and killed the wrong people and nobody asked questions about what happened because asking questions about Black Ops means your security clearance vanishes and your family gets called in for interviews. She stood very slowly. Walked back to Seattle General without knowing she was walking. Her legs moved on their own while her mind stayed somewhere over the Atlantic, in the place where classified operations go to die. The lobby had maybe 40 people in it at that moment, staff walking between units, a few early visiting families, orderlies moving stretchers, the usual organized chaos of a hospital at mid-morning. The Marine's question had hung in that space like a blade, nobody moving, nobody speaking. Then the hospital security chief, a man named Clayton, former Navy gunner's mate, someone Rachel had nodded to maybe 3 times in 3 weeks, went pale. Not slightly pale. Completely drained of color, the way someone goes pale when they understand exactly what they are about to witness. He stood at attention so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall. "Master Chief Petty Officer on deck." The words came out parade ground loud, the kind of volume that stops everything. 60 people froze mid-conversation, mid-movement, mid-thought. Orderlies straightened. A nurse dropped a pen and nobody moved to pick it up. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, as if the entire hospital was holding its breath. Rachel stepped into the lobby from the hallway where she'd been standing, her hands at her sides, her face absolutely blank. The 2 Marines turned to look at her simultaneously. Both of them nodded, a small gesture, exactly 1 degree of movement, but it was the kind of nod that said confirmation. That said welcome. That said we have come from a very long way to find you and we are not leaving without you. One of them touched his earpiece. "Reaper located. Stand by." Within 3 minutes, the conference room doors opened on the 2nd floor. A 2-star Admiral in full dress uniform walked through them, flanked by 4 additional Marines whose bearing was the kind that came from spending 3 decades in highly classified units. The Admiral moved through the hospital corridors like a man moving through water he had long ago learned to navigate. His uniform was creased so sharp it looked dangerous. His medals hung in 7 neat rows, and even from a distance, Rachel could see at least 3 commendation ribbons she recognized, the kind that only came from operations that still didn't officially exist. The hospital's administrative team was already gathered in the conference room, looking confused and slightly terrified. Dr. Whitfield stood by the window, his arms crossed, his face arranged in the expression of a man who was absolutely certain he had done something righteous and was waiting for validation. The 2-star opened a classified file folder that had a red stripe down the spine, the kind of stripe that meant nobody was supposed to see this. The kind of stripe that meant national security. The kind of stripe that meant Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres only existed in documents that got shredded every 6 months. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. The Admiral read the words as if he were introducing a state dignitary, not a woman in hospital scrubs who had been sitting in a diner 6 hours ago wondering if her hands would ever stop shaking. 3 purple hearts. He paused, letting that settle into the room. Silver star. Another pause. Longer this time. The medals were stacking up like evidence. Navy Cross. Whitfield's face had started doing something strange. The color was coming back, but wrong, too much red in the cheeks, the kind of red that came from capillaries dilating under extreme stress. His jaw was working slightly, like he was trying to speak and his body wouldn't cooperate. 26 years of classified operations, the 2-star continued, his voice carrying the kind of weight that came from reading the casualty lists. 16 combat deployments. Combat medical training from the Army 75th Ranger Regiment and Navy SEAL Team 3. 37 documented lives saved under direct fire. 2 of those lives saved in Fallujah in the summer of 2004. The door to the conference room opened again. A nurse wheeled in a wheelchair, and in that wheelchair sat the Admiral from room 4, fully awake now, no longer sedated, his color better, his eyes sharp and focused and locked directly on Rachel. He was still connected to a portable monitor, still had 2 full lines running, still looked like a man who had been inside a surgical base 6 hours ago. But he was here. The room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that happens when people are thinking about speaking. The kind of silence that happens when people understand they are about to witness something they will spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to other people who weren't in that room. The Admiral in the wheelchair wheeled himself forward, slowly, because his chest still hurt, because moving still cost him something, until he could see the cameras that hospital PR had rushed in, until he was positioned to be clearly visible and clearly heard. Behind him, the 2-star Admiral stood like a statue made of medals and authority. This woman, the Admiral in the wheelchair said, his voice steady and clear and strong, saved my life 48 hours ago when 5 doctors refused to help me. He let that land. 48 hours. 5 doctors. The exact mathematics of abandonment. This woman performed an emergency cardiac massage when I was in ventricular fibrillation, when my chest was already open, when the attending physician ordered her to stand down and wait. He paused. Swallowed once. She saved my life because she knew how. Because she had trained for exactly this moment. Because in Fallujah in 2004, when I was 9 years old and my father's convoy was hit by an IED, she pulled me from a burning Humvee and held me while my father bled out and promised me that she would make sure I lived. The room had stopped being a room. It had become a witness box, a confessional, a court where truth was being entered into the record, and everyone in it understood that this moment was going to change the shape of things. She kept that promise twice, the Admiral said. And Dr. Whitfield tried to take that away from her. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The heart monitor on the Admiral's portable unit beeped its steady rhythm, not the beeping of crisis, but the beeping of a man who was still alive because a woman in scrubs had refused to follow the chain of command. Because she had known, without anyone telling her, that some orders are meant to be broken. 60 people turned slowly to look at Dr. Whitfield. His mouth had opened slightly, but nothing came out. His hands had uncrossed and were now hanging at his sides, useless. The red in his face was still there, but now it looked like the red of something burning from the inside out. His eyes moved from the Admiral to Rachel to the 2-star, his brain clearly trying to process what was happening, how he had misjudged so completely, what the machinery that he had set in motion was about to do to him. Rachel's hands were still at her sides. Her face was still blank. But her right thumb was rubbing against her forefinger, the same small tell that had shown up in the administrator's office when he told her she was suspended. The only place where her body admitted what her voice would not. The tarnished military challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt warm against her ribs. The one her father had pressed into her bloody palm in Fallujah, before he told her to take his son and run, before he bled out into the sand, before everything else became the thing she couldn't talk about. She was still standing in the conference room of Seattle General, surrounded by 60 witnesses and 2 military branches and cameras filming everything, but a part of her was still in Fallujah, still 26 years old, still holding a 9-year-old boy and promising his dying father that this promise was a thing she could keep. She had kept it. Against 5 doctors. Against Dr. Whitfield's entire constellation of allies. Against an institution that had tried to erase her for 3 weeks straight. She had kept the promise. Now the world was watching her keep it. The 2-star Admiral turned to Whitfield with the precision of a man accustomed to giving orders that ended wars. You ordered 5 doctors to stand down while a flag officer was dying. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The parade ground authority in those 12 words made the air pressure change, made everyone in the conference room stop breathing. Whitfield's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. There were credentialing concerns, sir. Policy required that the employment investigation, she was under review and protocol stated, his words tumbled like stones down a cliff, each one smaller and more desperate than the last. You endangered the life of a United States Admiral because of a personal vendetta against a decorated Master Chief. The 2-star's eyes moved from Whitfield to the hospital administrator sitting 3 chairs down. The administrator's face had gone the color of old bone. That's reckless endangerment of a flag officer. That's obstruction of a service member. That's career-ending incompetence. The administrator cleared his throat. The sound echoed like a gavel in the sudden silence. Dr. Whitfield, you're relieved of your position effective immediately. The words came out clipped, clinical, the way a surgeon announces a diagnosis with no hope of remission. Whitfield's voice rose, cracking at the edges. You can't, I have board connections, I've been here 12 years, my record speaks for itself. His hands gripped the edge of the table like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid, but the whole room was tilting beneath him and he could feel it. Your record shows you threatened a Navy SEAL decorated with a Silver Star and a Navy Cross, the 2-star said. His face was carved from granite. I'm recommending a full military investigation into obstruction of a service member and reckless endangerment of a flag officer. The Navy takes that seriously, Dr. Whitfield. We take it very seriously. Hospital security moved forward. Two of them, both ex-military, both understanding exactly what they were witnessing, a man's institutional power collapsing in real time. The cameras were still rolling. The reporters had stopped writing and started filming instead. This was the moment. This was the story. The administrator spoke again, and this time he was speaking for the record. For the cameras. For the liability attorneys who were probably already drafting statements in some office 3 floors down. Dr. Whitfield, your employment with Seattle General is terminated immediately. Effective as of this moment. Security will escort you from the building. Whitfield's face went from red to white so fast you could almost see the blood drain out of him. He looked around the room like a man searching for a way out that didn't exist. The board members wouldn't meet his eyes. The residents were staring at their shoes. The nurses had gone absolutely silent. And Rachel stood motionless in the corner, her expression blank as marble, her hand steady at her sides, her face showing nothing but the calm competence of someone who had already survived the worst this world had to offer. "This is insane," Whitfield whispered. But his voice had already lost its authority. It sounded thin now. Desperate. Like a man who had just realized that the network he'd spent 12 years building, the connections he'd cultivated, the reputation he'd polished and protected, all of it meant nothing when you stood in a room with actual power. The kind of power that came from command, from service, from the kind of medals that couldn't be revoked by a hospital board. Security took his badge. They took his access cards. The leather wallet that held his credentials got emptied out on the conference table like evidence at a crime scene. Then they walked him out. Through the doors. Down the hallway. Past the nurses' station where he'd terrorized residents for over a decade. Past the residents themselves, who watched in absolute silence as he was escorted out like a patient being transferred to psychiatric care. The walk through the lobby took 40 seconds. 40 seconds for every nurse on the day shift to see him. 40 seconds for every camera to catch it. 40 seconds for his public humiliation to become his permanent record. He'd threatened Rachel with this exact walk. Security escorting her out in front of everyone, her reputation destroyed, her career finished. Instead it was happening to him. Within hours, the footage was viral. Dr. Whitfield was trending. The headline wrote itself, "Prominent physician terminated after threatening decorated Navy officer." The story got picked up by the national news outlets by evening. By morning, his medical license was under review by the state board. Every major hospital system in the Pacific Northwest added his name to their exclusion list. The credentialing alerts that he'd weaponized against Rachel became arrows fired back at him. 6 months later, Rachel stood on the roof of Seattle General at dawn, watching the city wake beneath her. The morning air smelled like rain and diesel exhaust from the delivery trucks 3 stories below. She'd been reinstated with full honors. There'd been a formal apology from the board. Her suspension had been erased from her record. Her badge now carried the rank she'd earned through 26 years of service, through 3 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star and a Navy Cross. Through Fallujah and 3 other deployments and every moment in between when she'd kept her mouth shut and her hand steady and her eyes on the work. The tarnished challenge coin was warm in her palm. She'd pulled it from her locker this morning, the coin that the Admiral's father had pressed into her bloody hands in the Jolan district of Fallujah 20 years ago, when a 9-year-old boy had watched his father bleed out beside a burning Humvee and a Navy SEAL had held him and promised she'd make sure he lived. She'd kept that promise. She was keeping it still. A helicopter appeared on the horizon, its rotors thumping the morning air like a second heartbeat. The UH-60M Black Hawk descended toward the rooftop pad with the precision of a pilot who'd done this 1,000 times. The Admiral emerged before the rotors fully stopped spinning, walking under his own power now, fully recovered, no trace of the open-chest surgery that had nearly killed him 6 months ago. He'd been in physical therapy for 4 months. Navy discipline. Military recovery protocol. He moved like a man who had learned how to survive a long time ago. He walked to her under the pale sunrise. The coin caught the light, dull metal, tarnished from 2 decades in a scrub pocket, priceless in a way that money could never touch. "I never got to thank you properly," he said. His voice carried the same parade ground authority as his commanding officers had, but quieter. More human. For either time. Rachel shook her head. "You survived. That's thanks enough." He saluted her. Sharp. Respectful. The gesture of one warrior to another, one person who understood the weight of survival to someone else who carried it every day. His fist came to his chest in the Navy tradition, and she returned it without hesitation. Master Chief to Admiral. The hierarchy was official, but the respect flowed both directions. As his helicopter lifted off into the sunrise, the rotors pushing the morning air like wind from a storm coming through, Rachel watched it disappear into the pink and gold sky. The city below was waking. Shift changes were happening. Patients were arriving in ambulances and rolling through the ER doors and making their way to the units where nurses were standing at their stations, ready. She pocketed the challenge coin. It felt heavier now, weighted with vindication and acknowledgement and the kind of respect that came from finally being seen for what you actually were. She headed back inside to the elevators, back down to the floors where the work was waiting. There were patients who needed her. There were rounds to make. There was medicine to practice without apology, without compromise, without ever again accepting that quiet competence was something to be ashamed of. Whitfield was teaching CPR at Portland Community College now. $18 an hour. No reputation. No board connections that would take his calls. His name was toxic in every major hospital system from Seattle to San Francisco. The network he'd spent 12 years building had evaporated in the time it took to walk through a lobby. But Rachel had something he'd never understand. She had purpose. She had honor. She had the quiet certainty of someone who had held the dying and kept the living and knew exactly what her hands were capable of doing. Her medical license was clean. Her service record was declassified enough to know that she'd done things most people couldn't imagine. Her patients trusted her because trust came from competence, and competence came from bleeding for your work. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.